Film of the week.
All right, so this week, first film we're starting with, we have watched Pixar's new animated film, Soul, that came out Christmas last year. It's got Tina Fey, Jamie Foxx, Graham Norton, and some other people, pretty big cast. Will, what did you think?
Okay, I've got to be honest, I really like this film. I think right off the gun, I don't know, I think Pixar puts out quality films, and there's this kind of debate I think I've seen going on online about, are animated films like separate from normal films, or are they actually just the same? Like, should they have their own category in awards, or should they all be clumped in? Because I'm of the opinion that animation's just an art form. It's not like it shouldn't be its own genre. And I think Pixar kind of demonstrate that really well with how they present some of their messages. So yeah, I liked it. I thought it had a really good message. I liked how the film kind of took you on a bit of a journey about what it was about. It kind of tricked me at a few points, but I think it had a decent ending. Maybe could have explored the ending a bit more. It kind of felt like it just stopped a bit. But overall, you know, what I like is this wasn't a film that was, you know, obviously aimed more at kids. It wasn't just something that made me a little bit sad and then resolved itself to make me feel happy. I think there was a bit more of a deeper meaning in that. And I think, you know, going out of that, being a kid and more watching it as an adult, it actually made me feel a little bit sad, a little bit like, what am I doing with my own life kind of thing? Questioning my own choices sometimes.
In a podcast, mate, you're living.
And yeah, I thought that was really interesting, a really interesting take on writing a film. I think what Pixar do really well as well is the basic story is like very, very simple. It's like an aspiring musician who's not doing stuff that he really enjoys. He gets an opportunity to do a gig. There's an obstacle, and at the end of it, he gets to do the gig kind of thing. There's no spoilers in that because that's not really what the film's actually about. The film is kind of more about exploring emotions and like a life journey rather than just the very basic plot, if you like. And I think Pixar do that generally really well. And it's something that I've seen in other films. I got to put it out there. Ratatouille is a great example of this. It's about a rat that can control a human and makes him cook. But the film is so much more than that. And I think Soul kind of emulates that really well as well. So yeah, that's kind of broadly what I thought about it.
Okay. Rory, what were you thinking? Do you think same sort of vibe or different levels?
No, I agree with everything you said, Will. I think as a Pixar film, it's up there for me. I think, yeah, and where it differs from most Pixar films and films I've watched recently is how challenging it is on that kind of higher existential level, which you don't normally get with Pixar films. I think you can get kind of deeper messages, a lot about like how to be a good person, how to like appreciate certain things. But I think like without spoiling the film too much, like the kind of questions of life and death are stuff that haven't really been touched upon in that many films, and really makes you question stuff. I did feel like the ending left me feeling a bit like dissatisfied. I think there was something missing there. It felt a bit like we were kind of all coming to terms with how it was going to end, and then it kind of got an easy out, which I didn't really like. I think I would have preferred we kind of eased into what we were all expecting. But no, as a film, I think it had a really good message. Maybe at times it tried to push that message a bit too much. Yeah. Maybe at other times it kind of got the message a little bit confused to the point where it kind of knew it couldn't answer the overarching question. But no, it's a good film and I enjoyed it.
Because I wasn't sure if I looked at this and I thought, well, this is like the heart wrencher that Disney and Pixar are so sort of acclaimed for. You know, you look at things like Toy Story, you know, films you probably watched a lot when I was younger, for example. And I really thought, wow, those are ones that sort of, whilst the message isn't so on the nose as Soul was, arguably I get more of sort of an emotional response from it. Whereas Soul was a little bit like, I get what they're going for. And I get, you know, there's this sort of lost purpose, existential crisis they're doing. But I didn't know if I loved that as sort of like, that's going to make you, you know, that's going to be the tearjerker when you watch it in cinemas or at home or whatever.
Go on. Sorry. I think that's a good point because is this film actually for kids? Like, it would be interesting to ask actual kids like what they think of watching this film, because I don't think kids would actually get as much from the film as maybe someone that's a bit older would get.
And that's so weird that you say that, because that's the exact same thing my mum said after we watched it together. She said, I don't know if kids would be at all bothered about what they're watching here. Because you're talking about things like why a child should be interested in things like jazz. I'm like, that's fine as a concept, but I think that's hard for like teenagers and adults to grasp if they don't inherently care about music and things like that. So if you're talking to like a 7-year-old, are they going to be that bothered about the premise of this person being able to play a concert with Dorothea Williams or whatever? I don't know if that's going to translate. And, as you said, Rory, talking about concepts of death and things like that, Disney doesn't shy away from these things. You look back at some of the classic, Bambi, you say, kills her mum in the first 4 minutes. And that's not a spoiler. If you haven't seen Bambi by now, you're not seeing Bambi, I'm sorry. And then they do it here and they delve into it way more, but I almost felt like it was building up like false concepts of how sort of life works. It's up to the artist's interpretation to a degree, but again, you're showing it to kids. You're not showing this to adults. So for them to see this and then sort of think, is there truth to this, or should I find this a believability? Because I still think at the end, I was under the impression that Soul was trying to prove that people do have an inherent purpose, even if you don't know what it is, that there is something to it, even though and then at the end, that's almost what they're trying to change away from. So that confused me, because I wasn't like, oh, that's immediately what they're trying to prove to me. I was more thinking, hold on, that's not really how I view life in general. And is that even going to translate to someone who's not thinking as hard about it as I'm trying to?
I think that's why I didn't like the ending, was that if you're arguing that life isn't about having a purpose, I didn't quite understand what they were like sending him back for, allowing him back for. Because it was like, if you're kind of supposed to just appreciate the moments you have, his time has kind of come to an end, and it's like they're sending him back kind of on a mission. Yeah, I think mission suggests there's a purpose. I don't know.
They made it was quite clear in the film once he'd done the gig that he'd realised that is what he'd wanted for his whole life, and that when he'd actually done it, he kind of felt a bit indifferent, and he was just going to do that same thing again and again. That's kind of what I was referencing at the start about thinking about what this film was about. I think at the start I was kind of thinking, okay, this is showing that you need a purpose in life to start enjoying it, and I was fine with that. And then I stayed along with when they kind of flipped that around, and we realized that just focusing on one thing in life is probably not a great thing, and actually enjoying the small things, like when we see 22 just doing simple things and collecting things on her journey when she's in Joe's body. That was equally as important. And in a way, you're right, like sending Joe back. Did they need to do that? Because I kind of got the impression that once he'd done the gig, that was kind of it. And it gave 22 a chance to come back.
Especially looking at it that way, like the whole point of Joe's journey through that film was that he was coming to terms with like his experience, and like how this kind of, whether he was on Earth for a reason, whether he lived for a reason, or whether it was just like him experiencing everything. And to send him back kind of suggests that he hadn't come to terms with it. Like, you kind of have to come to terms with death and accept that like you've moved on. To be honest though, what I quite liked about the film was that looking at kind of the themes of the afterlife, it didn't approach it from a religious angle at all. Like this kind of great beyond, there was no heaven and hell. There was no, I mean, it was kind of like purgatory, this like great before, but at the same time, it kind of didn't force you into one way of looking at things, I think, which was quite nice.
Yeah. And I think with this film, the original trailer was just about Joe in his human form and enjoying jazz.
Yeah.
And I think that got people really excited, because I personally, I don't know what you guys think, but I think the animation of the like human-like side of this film is actually really good. I think it's playful, unique. It had an individual edge on it, and I liked that. I think then what happened was they released the second trailer, which showed this kind of limbo stage. People saw that and kind of thought, oh, I don't know if this is what I kind of signed up for. And we almost had a complete 180 of people's reactions before the film had even come out, of like, I don't know if I'm going to enjoy this. And I've got to say, I think because the animation is so difficult for something like that, and they had to simplify the characters to have a bit of a differentiation, I wasn't as much of a fan of how they represented that. I don't know what you guys think. I think because the human-like animation was so like playful, and then the kind of limbo animation, it had to be simplified to have a differentiation. I think it lost a bit of that playfulness. I did like the Jerry characters. I thought like the animation of the scenery and stuff but was good, but the animation of the characters, I think it was a bit miss for me.
I mean,
kind of going back to basics personally, I think, like you said, kind of them simplifying it a little bit, whether that was to simplify the message, kind of making it less things to process, making you focus on like the meaning, maybe. What were you going to say, Harry?
Well, I mean, talking purely objectively about the animation, you know, in the grand scheme of things, this is a pretty massive leap, even considering sort of Pixar standards. You know, I'm thinking of recent Pixar films, or even going back again to things like Toy Story. I mean, that's what, a 20-year gap now. And this film shows more sort of, even just like the environmental look that they've got, if him walking around the city, or even as you were talking, you know, like the before and after life and death places, completely different and so abstract from what you would have expected before. I mean, my original thought was, I remember reading about Toy Story, you know, you've got Andy, who's the main sort of protagonist child, who obviously isn't in the story that much, and you've got Sid, who's the evil kid. They use, because Pixar was on a budget and animation was so difficult, they use the exact same body characters for both of them. So Andy and Sid look the exact same, apart from having different teeth and haircuts. And it's the same for all of Andy. Yeah, it's mad. And then it's the same for when Andy's friends come round. They all look the exact same. They didn't even bother changing their haircuts. They just changed their clothes and stuff. So what you're actually watching is one kid playing with himself. And I know I shouldn't really be saying that on a podcast, but that is ultimately what you saw in the original Toy Story. So this, as a differentiation, you know, even things like representing things like the subway a little bit more realistically, or just cities not being the cleanest, most polished places on earth, I just thought was really sort of, I respect them putting that much into the background rather than just the storyline they're trying to portray. Yeah. Although I would still prefer there was an emphasis on what they're trying to achieve as a message, rather than let's make it look good and then hope that the story sort of comes with it towards the end. Yeah,
even things like lighting, just going back to like how they animated stuff like in the jazz club. And I think we need to appreciate how difficult it is to animate people playing musical instruments and making that look realistic. I think particularly with the saxophone playing, like blown away. So my sister plays the saxophone, and genuinely I can tell you that looking at the animation of playing, it was just like completely spot on. Like she was pressing the right keys. The music was flowing. It was the same when Joe plays the piano. I play brass instruments again when the girl's playing the trombone throughout the film. It's just like, it's really, really well done. And I think that should be recognized, how difficult that can be and how far we've come in animation, because that was really impressive for me.
So what would we say? Say we were trying to look at this in areas we could have improved in Soul. We've said that the storyline doesn't really hit all the notes we wanted. I mean, one of the things that I read as well was that the original direction wasn't that the main character, Joe, was supposed to be a musician. He was supposed to be a scientist. But they didn't think that was almost accessible enough for people to understand sort of the altruistic nature of being a scientist. But also, I swear, like, the name Soul's a pun. Am I getting that wrong? Am I like, I understand souls are involved in it, but I thought the whole point was that he's also talking about sort of music as a genre. So them doing scientists, I didn't really know where that was going to go. But do you think that would have made, you know, had they adapted scientist rather than musician, do you think that would have improved or hurt this plot more than this point it was already at?
I think it would have hurt it simply because music is it's kind of known as like this window into the soul, right? And when they go to that place in the kind of Great Before, where it's like where the lost soul, no, not that place, where the kind of limbo between people who are living, but they are like enter this world through their kind of passions. I think it's interesting that when they actually went in there wasn't much other than people playing music. And like the one person skiing. So I think that kind of shows that music's a great way to like activate, what do they call it, their spark. I think it makes it quite an easy like medium. I don't know if I mean, I imagine scientists are just as passionate about like what they're passionate about.
It's about cells.
Like you said, I think it's harder to kind of visually put that into a film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Will, what would you, if you were going to change this plot up, what would you be going for to change it? If you're not going to change, you're going to keep him as a musician, you're going to keep the basic. What are you really switching up to make this more what you would have enjoyed to watch?
Well, as someone that plays music themselves, I wouldn't call myself a musician, far from it, but someone that enjoys playing music and listening to music. I was a bit surprised at the lack of music in the film. It sounds strange, but the jazz, for example, was very, very accessible to the viewer, and that's fair enough, because at the end of the day, it's aimed at kids. I think these days in music, there's so many people doing really crazy things that to have any kind of like experimental jazz or stuff in there would have been interesting, to say the least. Probably would have been a big miss. But they could have really highlighted how much music meant to Joe, and by showing him playing a lot more. We've talked about how good the animation was. I'm sure they would have been able to portray how important music is in his life, and that kind of really would have emphasized the message they were giving more. I would say I liked the music that they played. Again, the jazz was really nice. I thought it was actually quite an interesting move. I don't know if you noticed when that Terry character. I would like to talk about Terry a bit later as well. But when Terry was kind of, I guess, hunting down Joe and 22, for a better word, the music was really in contrast to the other music in the film. So it was very synthetic, electronic, basic rhythms, simplified. Whereas when we were watching Joe and his story and listening to music that was going on in the background, that was obviously jazz. So very free flowing acoustic instruments, live kind of stuff. Maybe something that a lot of people might have missed, but something I picked up on that was, I was really impressed. I thought that was a really nice touch. But if this is a film about music and finding a spark, I think we really could have done with seeing Joe enjoying his music a lot more than just what we got at the very start of the film. Also, the length. We touched on the length. I'm not sure what this is about, but I just quickly looked on Disney Plus at previous Pixar films that were released, and it seems they've kind of got a very uniform length that they like to keep their films to. It's in this kind of 1 hour 45 to 2 hour slot, and closer to the 1 hour 45, to be honest. I think this film is like 1 hour 44 minutes. I looked at Coco and it was 1 hour 47. So it'd be interesting to see if that was a decision that they just had to cut kind of the development that could have happened at the end of the film.
Did you feel like it was kind of rushed towards the end of the film?
Yeah, I did. I'll be honest, when I initially watched it, it wasn't so much of an issue. It resolved itself quite nicely. We got a result that meant no one, didn't exist anymore. Conceptualize that a bit. But I did read other people's opinions after the film, and it was something that came up quite a lot, and I thought about it, and I do agree. I mean, it would have been nice to see maybe what does 22 do with her life. I think it's interesting that they left that out of it. It kind of it leaves it open ended, which is no bad thing. But yeah, it would have been interesting to see what 22 did. Maybe just like a flashback or a fast forward. I
agree. I think it could have literally just been like a person walking past Joe on Earth, and like with a baby or something, and there's like this weird kind of thing. But I think the way, I don't know whether this was to make it more accessible to children. Obviously, we've talked about the fact that Pixar films always kind of branch across age groups, and the kind of deeper message of the film is quite complex and hard to get your head around. But I think at the end, the fact that the message of the film was literally put into the script and were the final words kind of made me feel like I'd rather it really wasn't that simplified and like diluted for me. Like the whole idea of putting a message into a film is that you're communicating something with like a piece of art. And just like having the main character speak the words to you right at the end is a bit jarring, I felt.
Yeah, I think they knew the message didn't translate properly. I think, especially if you're going to sit down your kids in front of that, not that any of us have kids, but like if you're going to sit down children in front of that and tell them what's the message without them seeing almost that on the nose sentence to explain it, are they really going to get that? I just don't think so. So if we look at the sort of acting talent that's alongside this film, I mean, Disney never have casts that you don't know any names in. Do you know what I mean? We've got Jamie Foxx here, Tina Fey, Graham Norton doing some voices, Richard Ayoade, among others you'll have seen or heard in tons of other films, Pixar and otherwise. What do we think?
I quite like the diversity they brought to it. I think it's another topic that we should maybe talk about, with this kind of being branded as like a I can't remember what it was called on Disney Plus, but like a black excellence, black culture kind of film. But the diversity of the voices, especially with Jamie Foxx, and then the people that played Jerry, I quite liked the fact that in Limbo, kind of before The Great Beyond, there were like seemingly voices from all over the world. It wasn't just like in a very Americanized, like, welcome to like heaven or the future or whatever.
Yeah. No, agree. I think it was nice that they didn't use a British person as well for that kind of pseudo evil character in Terry. Thank God. Yeah. How many times do we get slapped with that one, guys? But on that, I've got to say the voice for what's it, guys? Jerry. Voice, Terry or Jerry? It's Terry, isn't it?
Terry's the Australian one, yeah.
Yeah. So the voice for Terry, I've got to say I wasn't actually a big fan of. I don't know what it was. It wasn't that it was muffled. The voice wasn't muffled, but it was kind of, and it's not because it's an Australian accent as well, by the way, because I can fully comprehend that.
Quite out as a racist on the first podcast.
It just felt like the speech was not clear enough. You know, if you're going to portray someone that's antagonizing your main character and kind of hunting them down, you want that speech to be really clear so that you can understand what that person's doing and where they're going. I don't know. It was interesting to me as well to find out that this was a woman that did the voice, presumably for a male character. I just didn't think it was particularly well done. And that was actually quite a big letdown for me when I was trying to pick holes in this film. May not be as significant for you guys, but just being able to understand one of like the main characters is fairly important.
No, I agree. And I think personally, I didn't enjoy the character of Terry that much throughout the film. I think as soon as they were introduced, it very much felt like, here's the bad guy, here's the villain. And like, I don't really think he was that necessary, like to the message of the film. The idea that there's this like person in purgatory, like counting how many people die and how many people go to the Great Beyond. It felt a bit forced, and kind of like you mentioned, the chase scenes with the music. I think that was a great touch, but I don't know. It just felt like a bit of a plot device that was a bit forced.
I mean, I think as well, with these films, because if you were to look at this film, let's say without this Terry character, because for all intents and purposes, Terry is the sort of antagonist. I think that'd be fair to say, wouldn't it? So if you're talking about this film without a proper antagonist, 22 sort of becomes the antagonist if that character isn't there. And then it doesn't really work in terms of like, stories naturally have to have some sort of protagonist-antagonist conflict climax, which ends in a resolution. And without Terry, I think they were almost lacking in the middle of what you're really watching. Because otherwise, you're just watching the main two characters talking to each other, not getting on, and then getting on each other's nerves without any sort of, I suppose it's a subplot, is what you call it more than anything else. And I agree, I don't think it was necessary, but I think they had to just break up the relentless two characters talking and butting heads for the entire story.
I think, again, that's where they get caught up in the complexity of the message of the film. Because if you're talking about like a man's struggle with life, there is no antagonist in that. Like, there's no person who's like killing you and unless you are murdered. There's no person who is like counting your life and like ticking you off a list and sending you into the afterlife. So yeah. I think as a film, it's difficult to get past that. But if that is your message, I don't know how necessary it was to include that character.
Yeah. And again, I think that's them trying to dumb it down for children yet again. Like, I think if you were going to give them purely the concept of man's struggle with himself, that's even harder to relate with than the story that they've already ended up pumping out. So if you give them that on top of like, I think the reason as well that Terry was Australian was just because if Jerry, for example, has 3 or 4 different voices, as he or she does in the whole film, you've got to have something so disparate from what you've already heard that even a child can recognize that they are listening to someone who isn't who they've already seen. So they do it with the animation, that's fine. They're still quite similarly animated. If you weren't paying a ton of attention, you wouldn't notice. So by making it that very sort of, as you said, Will, with the background music, very obviously different and separate to what you've seen so far, is them forcing an antagonist into a story that, as you say, Rory, doesn't need it, and the end of the film doesn't really benefit from having it either.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I agree. I think because this is aimed at children, we need an antagonist in the story. I think I'm going to bring it up again, guys. Ratatouille does this really well, and a big criticism of that film is the character of Skinner. So if you guys are familiar with the film, Skinner is kind of like the chef that takes over Gusteau's restaurant, and I would argue that he's not really needed in the film, and the drawbacks of that film, or the things that are poor about that film potentially, even though it's a good film, is his involvement. It's a lot more difficult to make a film that's enjoyable to watch when you have to just explore the relationships between characters, and you kind of have to develop that and get the audience to form their own opinions. When you take out that antagonist, because that antagonist gives you something to fight against, it gives the audience something to kind of not want to succeed, and want the main characters to rise up against. So I think Soul could have removed the character of Terry. It makes their job more difficult, and at the end of the day, because it's a children's film, I think we're always going to get an antagonist in it. But yeah, interesting to think where it could have gone if he just wasn't in there, because he wasn't required to to create this relationship between the limbo stage and being in real life. We kind of had other plot points with the body swap and all that kind of stuff that meant that they needed to come backward and forward. It wasn't required for Terry to kind of like go out and hunt Joe and bring him back and stuff, because at the end of the day, we got that with him falling down that hole at the very start. And so, yeah, I don't know. Wasn't a big fan of Terry. Was not a big fan.
What did you guys make of? I know he wasn't a major role, but Rich Daiwadi as one of the Jerrys.
See, I don't know.
Personally, I've got a weird issue with Rich Daiwadi in like serious films. I just can't take him seriously.
I was
when
just
he does
thinking,
that voice, I just can't get on board. He's doing the IT crowd voice, and like, fine, that's where you made your money. But he's now, I feel, established as the monotonous. It's like pseudo comedy. It's funny without being funny.
So not obviously being a film guy, I don't look at casts before I watch films, so I'm not really that interested. And I wrote in my notes as soon as I heard his voice, Richard Ayoade is in something else. Like, you get one HSBC advert in the UK, and all of a sudden you're on like every film that you can voice act on. I've got to be honest, I didn't really like him as the character. I don't think he voice acted this film particularly well. I don't think his voice was that animated. Again, it was nice to hear like a diversified range of different voices playing that Jerry character. But he missed the mark for me on this one. I don't think he was particularly animated.
I completely agree with you, Will. I think I didn't enjoy it that much. Whereas on the flip side, I really enjoyed Graham Norton's character.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I really wanted to bring it up.
Both in the kind of Great Beyond and in the real world, I think it was just a really nicely written character. And I found it really funny, the idea of like a guy who kind of works at like a hippie shop spinning a sign connects with like this deeper level soul, where he like saves kind of lost souls and gets them back into the real world.
I thought it was really good that they had a character like that, and he was actually one of my favorite characters that was cast in the film. I thought his voice was really good. Another UK, popular culture person that I wasn't initially expecting to be in a film like this, but yeah, he did a really great job. I think it was nice that in modern society, people that I guess I identify that are similar to his character, I think, they obviously get mocked a little bit in society. Kind of people don't really understand the spiritual side of life sometimes. I'm probably one of those people, to be honest. I think it was nice that in a film aimed at kids, his character had value at the end of the day. It was his character that enabled the story to kind of resolve itself more towards the end. And in a society that might think that these kind of people don't really have a place, and in the very what am I trying to say, capitalist Western world that we live in.
The accountant speaks up.
Going in hard. But you know what I mean. Spiritual people, they do get a bit poo-pooed by regular society, and I think it was nice that kids were kind of introduced to a character like this that at the end of the day, did have a place in society and helped resolve help resolve the story. I thought that was a nice touch.
Okay, so overall, what sort of if we're going to rank this film, and it's also worth saying we haven't built a ranking system yet. We're going to do this on the fly. Where are we thinking that this sort of fits in our own scales of not only Pixar films but films in general?
I see it as going, if we're doing tiers, going in that kind of maybe middle to the high of the good tier.
Yeah.
I don't think it's reaching great. It could be pushing very good, but I feel like endings can really sway me between between very good and good. And like that ending just brought it back into good for me. If I was giving it a number, I'd give it somewhere like a high 7, maybe a middling 7.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, again, we haven't figured this ranking system out, so we might have some names so we can actually picture. But I agree with Rory. I think when I first watched the film, I had such strong feelings after watching the film about myself that I initially thought this has to be a really good film, a great film, to be honest. I rewatched it again for the pod, and I had similar feelings. Watching something again for the second time mainly does change your opinion. I think it's rare that you kind of watch something again and think exactly the same. It lowered it down. If I was going to put a number on it, I think I'd give it a 7.9. I think 7.9 is fair, just shy of great. Although, I would be open to putting it maybe in great category for me. I think it had a great message, and just because Pixar is associated with making kids films for kids, was this a kids film? I don't think so. Does that really matter? Not for me, because I still thought it was good. So I would put it in great, but giving it a 7.9.
I think I would say it's a middle 6. Maybe a high 6. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to be a cynical one. That's fine. So if we're saying, for example, this is just in my mind though, if we're saying this is a film that is not purely for kids because of almost the message doesn't get portrayed, because this is how I'm thinking. I'm thinking on the one hand, it's either a film made for kids that doesn't translate a message well enough for children to really understand. So in that respect, that's a negative, which is fine for me. But then if you're saying that, okay, this is a film that's actually got more of an adult, more of an older message for people, I think that you've got to sort of portray this film for what it truly is. It's not a music film. It is a sort of an existential thing. And it's not, I just don't think it's the most effective at translating what it's trying to say without being so blatant. It's almost like, yeah, okay, I get the message you're saying. You don't have to literally shout it at me. So I'd love to put it higher. And I think it looks great. And I think the voice acting is good, but I just don't see it going higher than a sort of 7 for me. I think, if I'm looking at the scale of Disney films, there is better, and I think this could have been done better. But I still think I'd put it in like it's worth a watch category. I think that's where I'd fairly say.
Yeah, definitely check it out if you've not seen it, and form your own opinions.